The hum of the engines was constant, soothing, almost hypnotic. First class on international flights was another world. Champagne before takeoff, seats that reclined into beds, and silence that cost more than most people earned in a month. Into this curated luxury stepped a man who didn't belong. He wasn't tall. He wasn't dressed in tailored suits or luxury brands. His coat was simple, his shoes scuffed. He walked with the steady, unhurried pace of someone who had no interest in impressing anyone. He carried no designer luggage, only a small, battered duffel. When he arrived at seat 2D, a few eyes glanced up, and then the first laugh. A woman with a diamond bracelet leaned toward her partner. He looks like he made a wrong turn. The man beside her chuckled. Maybe he's staff, or a seat upgrade by accident. Whispers rippled quietly, like a breeze through velvet. In the front row, a venture capitalist with too much tan and too little humility turned his head just enough to comment loud enough for everyone to hear. First-class charity program now, huh? No one confronted him. The elderly man sat down without a word. He looked around once, not out of nervousness but as if cataloging the space. Eyes that had scanned 100 places before. Eyes that saw through people faster than their price tags ever could. The flight attendant approached. Young, eager, polished. "Excuse me, sir, may I see your ticket?" He handed it over wordlessly. She blinked, smiled. "Of course, my apologies." A billionaire heiress 2 rows behind them rolled her eyes. Must be a glitch in the system. And just like that, the mood was set. The rest of the passengers, powerful CEOs, heirs to fortunes, elite tech moguls, all knew each other, some by name, others by reputation. They exchanged nods, toasts, predictions about global markets. Only one man sat outside the web. He wasn't part of their world, not in appearance, not in behavior, not in volume. And yet, there was something unsettling about his calm. It wasn't the quiet of fear or submission. It was the quiet of someone who didn't need to prove anything by the time the plane began taxiing. The old man had already closed his eyes, not to sleep, but to detach, as if the flight itself was just another stretch of road to cross. Nothing more. Around him, conversations continued. "I just closed a Series D in Singapore. We're acquiring 2 media arms next quarter. My villa in Corsica is being renovated. You should see the pool." None of it touched him, none of it mattered. And somewhere between the laughter and the wine lists, no one noticed that their indifference was building a moment that would soon collapse under the weight of truth. Because soon, the air would change. Soon, silence would speak. And soon, they would realize who was sitting just a few feet away. 20 minutes into the flight, the gossip intensified. By now, the novelty of the mysterious old man had become entertainment for those with nothing better to mock. The champagne had loosened tongues, and the altitude gave people the illusion of altitude and character. The whisper network was in full swing. "Did you see his shoes? Definitely not Italian leather. Is that a plastic watch? Maybe he's someone's driver who got confused." The flight attendant passed by again. She hesitated for a moment before pausing at his seat. "Sir, just to confirm, you're assigned to seat 2D, correct?" He looked up with eyes that didn't blink easily. "Yes." She nodded a little too quickly and moved on, but the question had been asked aloud. The validation wasn't for him, it was for the others. Reassurance that their space hadn't been breached unjustly, that they were still among their own. The old man resumed his quiet across the aisle. A young tech billionaire leaned toward his assistant's security detail. "Maybe he looks like he's waiting for someone." The assistant smirked. "Maybe he's wearing a wire." The billionaire laughed out loud. "He's probably here to fix the plumbing. Poor guy got bumped up by mistake." Several passengers chuckled, not maliciously, but with that insidious upper-class laughter that slices deeper than open cruelty. The man in 2D didn't react, but behind that stillness was something sharper than any insult hurled his way. He didn't carry embarrassment, he carried memory somewhere. Near the back of the cabin, a journalist recognized something strange. She didn't speak, not yet, but something about the man's posture, the stillness, the way he subtly scanned his surroundings without appearing to move it, triggered something in her mind. She had seen that kind of discipline before, in war zones. Meanwhile, the elite continued. A hedge fund titan clinked his glass and toasted the cabin to liquidity in markets and manners. Laughter, polite applause. The old man said nothing. He hadn't touched the welcome drink, hadn't opened the flight menu, just sat with his duffel at his feet, hands resting calmly, eyes occasionally closing, not in fatigue, but in some private discipline unknown to the rest. Then came the question that shifted the energy. A young CEO, barely in his 30s and too loud for his own wisdom, leaned forward and said with theatrical politeness, "Excuse me, sir, do you mind if I ask what do you do?" The old man didn't look up, but he answered, "I'm retired." That was it. No titles, no companies, no grand past. Just a word that ended curiosity and deepened the mystery. Retired from what service? Business? Survival? The cabin didn't laugh this time. They didn't know why, but something about his voice carried weight, not volume. Weight. And when the flight attendant brought the dinner service, she placed the tray in front of him with more care than before. He nodded. She lingered half a second. The billionaire in seat 1C frowned. Even service was beginning to shift toward him. That wasn't part of the rules. But the rules, as they were about to learn, were about to mean nothing at all, because something was coming. And when it arrived, the hierarchy of the air would crumble. 35,000 feet above the ground, the world changed in seconds. It began with a jolt, minor turbulence, the kind most first-class passengers brush off with a sip of wine and a glance out the window. But then came the second hit, stronger. The lights flickered. A tremor passed through the cabin. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Forks paused halfway to mouths, eyes lifted from tablets and portfolios. Then came the third strike, harder, longer. The cabin lurched. A tray slipped. A glass shattered, the lights dimmed for a breath too long, and in that fragile heartbeat, the mask of wealth cracked. Someone screamed. A woman in 3A clutched her armrest. Another gripped her pearl necklace like it might save her. The oxygen masks dropped, mechanical, abrupt, dangling like silent warnings. Panic bloomed fast and sharp. A young investor started hyperventilating. A private equity exec fumbled for her phone. Someone shouted, "Is this normal?" And amid the chaos, the man in 2D didn't move. He didn't reach for his mask. He didn't flinch. Instead, he opened his eyes calmly and looked around the cabin like a cartographer scanning a map. Not for exits, not for drama. He was assessing breathing patterns, voice tension, muscle behavior. He saw it all. He had seen it all before. The young tech mogul beside him noticed. "Why aren't you panicking?" he asked, breathless. The old man didn't answer. He was already counting rows, scanning angles. There was something methodical in his gaze, something surgical. Then came the sound from the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. Speaking, we've encountered unexpected turbulence. Please remain calm and seated." Flight attendants secured the cabin immediately. But the cabin wasn't calm. It was unraveling. A woman in 4B fainted. A crew member rushed over, then froze, unsure of what to do. That's when the old man moved, silently, precisely. He unbuckled his seatbelt, stood up, and stepped across the aisle. He didn't stumble, the plane shook, but his steps didn't. He knelt beside the woman, checked her pulse, eyes skin-toned, and then, from beneath his jacket, he removed something. Not a stethoscope, not a syringe, a badge, worn, faded, the kind that doesn't belong to any hospital, the kind with an insignia that told a different story, military. The passengers looked confused at first. What kind of medical help was this? Then someone from the rear of the cabin gasped. "Wait, is that?" Recognition flickered. A man in a business suit, pale, sweating, leaned forward and squinted. "I've seen that badge before. In Kabul, that's not just military, that's deep operations." The whisper spread faster than the turbulence. The quiet man, the one mocked for his clothes, the one doubted for his silence. He was something else, something more. And yet he said nothing. He stabilized the woman, directed the crew, spoke calmly, not in panic, in command. The same people who had laughed hours earlier now watched breathless. The captain's voice came again. "We're stabilizing. Hold tight. Medical personnel, if you're on board, please assist." But the man in 2D had already done more than assist. He had taken control, and when he stood again, mask in hand, gaze unwavering, the cabin didn't see an old man anymore. They saw a question mark becoming an exclamation, and they began to wonder, not just who he was, but what he had survived. The cabin had shifted, not just the pressure, the atmosphere. Something intangible now hovered in first class, a presence, heavy and sobering. No one had yet spoken aloud what they were thinking, but the question burned behind every glance. Who is he? The turbulence began to ease, but the passengers did not. They watched the man in 2D return to his seat, slowly, deliberately, like a chess piece moving back into place after disrupting the board. The fainted woman was recovering. The crew whispered in corners, unsure of who had taken charge and yet too relieved to challenge it. The tech mogul who had once mocked the old man now stared at him with the eyes of someone trying to reread a book they had tossed aside. He leaned forward. "Sir, I didn't know you had training." The man looked over, not coldly but as though answering a question already understood. "I had experience," he said quietly, "a long time ago." Then he closed his eyes again, but this time they weren't dismissed. The words had opened, a door just wide enough to invite memory into the cabin. A door someone recognized. In row 5, a man stood. Not hurriedly, not theatrically. He had silver hair, precise posture, and the calmness of someone who never had to raise his voice to be heard. Seat 1A. That passenger manifest had him listed as G. Thorne, founder and CEO of Ares Global Defense, retired 4-star general, current billionaire defense contractor. Net worth $8.7 billion. He walked the aisle slowly, ignoring the surprised looks from passengers. Not toward the cockpit, not toward the crew. He walked toward the old man. And stopped in front of him. The two locked eyes. A long pause. Then, in front of the entire first-class cabin, General Thorne stood at attention and gave a formal military salute. The breath of the cabin caught in collective lungs. The old man didn't immediately respond. Instead, he slowly rose to his feet. There was no grand music, no speech, only a nod, a silence, and then, "Recognition. I didn't expect to see you again," Thorne said, his voice roughened by something deeper than time. You shouldn't have, replied the old man. You were supposed to die that night. The cabin froze. What night? Someone whispered. Thorne turned to face the passengers. You're sitting with someone who saved 126 soldiers in a single night, he said. Including me. Gasps. No applause. No exclamations. Only the sudden, disorienting realization that history had been seated among them. In silence, while they postured and preened and laughed at the man who had carried more than any of them ever. I wouldn't be here. Thorne continued. If he hadn't pulled me from a fire zone in Bag, he refused extraction until everyone else was safe. He didn't ask for medals. He never even went public. Phones went down. Eyes dropped. Shame rippled like a second wave of turbulence, internal this time. Deeper, more lasting. He's a ghost, by design, the general added, but some ghosts should be remembered. The old man simply sat back down. He didn't gloat, didn't smile. He had no interest in being admired. That wasn't why he was there. He had just wanted to go home. But now, every person on that plane knew they weren't in the presence of anonymity. They were in the presence of legacy. The silence was no longer awkward. It was reverent. Every eye in first class was now drawn not to champagne bottles, not to status symbols, not to seat numbers, but to the man in 2D, the man who, for the first half of the flight, had been a subject of mockery. Now, he was the axis around which the cabin rotated. General Thorne didn't return to his seat instead. He looked at the man, paused, then did something no one expected. He gestured to his own chair, seat 1A, the most prestigious spot in the entire aircraft, sir, he said solemnly. Please, take my seat. The old man blinked slowly, shaking his head. That's not necessary, but the general didn't waver. It is. Then he turned, looked at the crew. I'll be standing until landing. A murmur of shock ran through the cabin. The billionaire general, standing by choice to give his seat not to royalty, not to a president, but to a silent war hero the world had forgotten. The lead flight attendant approached. Unsure. General, with respect, we have regulations. I am not requesting, Thorne said, calm but firm. I'm honoring. The old man reluctantly stood. There was no applause, just people rising to their feet, not in rebellion, but in instinct. They couldn't stay seated as this took place. The general guided him to 1A. The man sat slowly, his posture still humble, still modest, but this time no one saw simplicity. They saw weight. They saw history. They saw the man they should have seen from the beginning. As the old man settled in the leather recliner, the flight attendant returned. Tray in hand. Sir, she said gently, may I bring you anything? He looked up with kind eyes. A moment of peace would be enough. The cabin obeyed. Phones remained in pockets. Conversations quieted to murmurs of reflection. Even the most hardened, wealth-anchored minds felt the shift. They had been taught that wealth was the ultimate currency, but now they were witnessing something far rarer. Respect. Earned. Not demanded. Not bought. And then a voice. Soft. Young from row 3. A boy, maybe 12, traveling with his father. He stood uncertain, holding something. It was a toy, a small plastic soldier. He walked down the aisle nervously and approached the old man. Sir, my dad says you're a hero. I just wanted to give you this. He extended the figurine, eyes wide. The old man stared at it, not at the object, but what it represented. A gesture, a tribute, unscripted, pure. He took it slowly, and for the first time in the entire flight, he smiled, not politely, but deeply, a smile that came from a place long hidden, long buried under years of silence. Thank you, son, he said softly. This means more than you know. The boy beamed and returned to his seat. The general, now leaning quietly against the bulkhead, crossed his arms and watched. He didn't need acknowledgement. This wasn't a show. It was justice, subtle, silent, complete. And in that high-altitude sanctuary, above the noise of the world, a truth settled like morning fog. Some people build empires, others save them. And when those two paths cross, it is not the wealthy who are honored, it is the worthy. The sky outside had long since darkened. The lights inside the cabin were dimmed now, set to a quiet glow, not out of necessity, but out of respect. Conversations were hushed, movement slowed, and where laughter once had filled the space, now there was only stillness. It wasn't fear, it was awe. The billionaire general remained by the galley wall, arms crossed, his eyes locked, not on the old man but on everyone else, watching them, measuring their reactions, not judging, simply making sure they understood what had just occurred. The old man, now seated in 1A, sat quietly, staring out the window. He didn't bask in attention, he didn't return stares. His thoughts were elsewhere, perhaps with the 126 lives he had once carried across a battlefield, or the soldiers he hadn't been able to save. The cabin only knew a fraction of what he had done, but that fraction was enough to shift their entire world. One by one, the passengers began to stand, not to gawk, not to congratulate. They approached in silence. Some offered a nod, others whispered a quiet thank you. A woman placed a single flower on the table beside him, taken from her own handbag, clearly planned for someone else, but now finding its rightful place. The man did not seek these gestures, but he accepted them with the same calm dignity with which he had accepted mockery earlier. The billionaire from sea to sea, the one who had joked about plumbing, was now standing awkwardly, hands shaking slightly, unsure of what to say. He knelt. "I didn't know," he said. The old man looked at him, not with contempt, but with a gaze that saw through him. "You weren't supposed to," he replied gently. Then he added, "But now that you do, carry it with care." That single line, "carry it with care," pierced the air more sharply than any rebuke could have had. It wasn't about guilt, it was about growth nearby. The journalist who had first sensed something now sat typing feverishly, her laptop open on her knees, but her story would not be a scandal or exposed. It would be titled, "The Man in 2D and the Truth We Almost Missed." In the galley, the flight crew had stopped moving mechanically. They now served with awareness, posture straightened, words measured. Even at 35,000 feet, they understood they were part of something they would never forget. And then the intercom. The captain's voice, this time calm and composed. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will begin our descent shortly. On behalf of the crew, I thank you for your patience and for the privilege of sharing this journey with someone whose service transcends borders." No name was mentioned. None was needed. Everyone knew. As the plane tilted slightly in preparation for landing, a few passengers glanced at their watches, but not to check time. To mark it. To remember this flight by more than its destination. And just before the wheels touched down, the general walked over one last time. He leaned down, speaking low. "I've fought beside giants, but none walked more quietly than you." The old man didn't respond. He simply nodded once, because true legacy doesn't demand words, it simply is. The wheels kissed the runway with a gentle thud. The plane decelerated, and the cabin exhaled, not in relief, but reverence. It wasn't just a landing, it was the end of a passage, a flight that had begun in hierarchy and ended in humility. The aircraft taxied toward the gate. The captain's voice returned. "This is your captain speaking. We've been informed that military personnel will be present upon arrival. Please remain seated until the honor guard completes their movement." The words rippled through the cabin. Honor guard for a man who had sat in silence. The passengers looked at one another, now bound not by status or wealth, but by an experience they couldn't quantify. There were no more jokes, no more whispered guesses, no more cynicism, only stillness. When the aircraft doors finally opened, the jet bridge was empty, except for 2 rows of uniformed personnel standing at attention. Not for a dignitary, not for a politician, for him, a man once mocked for his coat and shoes, a man once mistaken for an error in the seating chart. Now, every motion was deliberate. The billionaire general walked first, clearing a path. Then came the old man. He stood slowly, adjusting nothing. He didn't straighten his back. He didn't smooth his clothes. He simply gathered his duffel bag, the same battered, faithful thing that had carried his life, and stepped forward, 1 row at a time. Passengers stood as he passed. No clapping, no flashes, just presence, just witness at the jet bridge threshold. 2 officers saluted. The old man nodded once and walked between them outside. A corridor had been formed, a ceremonial path lined with men and women in uniform, some active, some retired, some too young to have served beside him, but old enough to understand what he represented. That at the very end, a single vehicle waited, unmarked, simple, just like him. As he approached, a young soldier stepped forward and opened the door. But before the old man entered, he turned back once to face the plane. The passengers watched through the windows. He raised his hand, not in a wave, but in a gesture of closure, a quiet farewell. Then he disappeared inside the vehicle, pulled away with no entourage, no flashing lights, just purpose. Back on the jet bridge, no one moved. Not for a while. The general remained last to disembark. When asked by the journalist why he hadn't flown private, he smiled. "Because some flights," he said, "are meant to teach us who we still are." That day, headlines would not carry his name, but in whispers, in retellings, in humbled recollections across boardrooms and banquets, the story would be passed down. They had shared a flight with someone extraordinary, not because of what he owned, but because of what he carried. Honor. And as the general walked alone into the terminal, he glanced at his phone. One message received from a private, restricted contact. "Thank you for letting the silence speak." He smiled, slipped the phone into his pocket, and disappeared into the crowd. And thus, the world was reminded once more, money may fill seats, but only honor fills hearts. And so, the flight ended, but the story didn't. Because somewhere between takeoff and landing, between silence and revelation, we were all reminded of something the world keeps trying to forget. Status isn't measured by luxury, it's measured by legacy. That man, the one they laughed at, the one they doubted, didn't raise his voice, didn't show his medals, didn't demand respect. He simply lived in a way that made silence louder than applause. At BillionDollarCurve, we don't just tell stories about wealth. We tell the stories that wealth alone could never earn. If you've ever witnessed a moment where dignity shattered perception, tell us in the comments if this story reminded you that true value can walk in silence. Share it, and if you believe the world needs more reminders like this, subscribe. Because the quietest men often carry the loudest truths.